Hey everybody, I'm Kevin. I'm not childish, but I'm talking about a lot of the stuff that I was childish about, and this is another episode of Why Me. And this one I said I'd talk about my parents. I want to make it clear that I think they fucked up a good bit raising me. But I'm not blaming them. It's, you might say, the way it was supposed to be. They had the way they were raised, which brought them into the way they were going to raise me. They didn't seem to challenge the way their parents raised them, like I challenged my parents about the way they raised me. Because when I raised my children, I really tried to be different. I know that in some ways I wasn't, but I did try. The big thing that seemed to be agreed upon by the two of them is that children are supposed to be seen and not heard. And children were supposed to do what they were told, not what their parents did. Right from the start, my mother did not hold me unless I needed to be fed or my diaper changed. If I cried, I just kept on crying. She didn't seem to enjoy being around children as far as just for the fun of it, to play with us. In a strange way, I'll say we weren't toys for her amusement, which in some ways is good, but in others there was lack of affection. I've said this before, but I'll say this one again. They never told me I did a good job. They never hugged me. There were no kisses. There were no pats on the back. There was no good job. There was no thank yous. I might have to take back the thank yous. They might have thanked me for something here and there. I don't know. But I'll guarantee you, no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. And they made sure I knew that. Severe punishment for things that made no sense, things I didn't understand. And I've talked about them in other things, like one time I got my mouth washed out with soap. Another time, because of my inability to study and my fear of a teacher, I got bad grades, so I wasn't going to be allowed to go to on the school trip, things like that. So, and as I grew up, my mother made sure, though, I had 3 meals a day right on the money. 6 o'clock in the morning when I walked down the steps, there was my meal, and it was going to be eggs, cereal, orange juice, milk, And then if I want something else, maybe a banana or cinnamon toast or something like that. Now I'd make that myself. You know, any of the extras you had to deal with yourself. Always had lunch. Now, of course, at school, you always had lunch. We never were allowed to pack our lunch. We always had to take and buy the school lunches, which were horrible. The clothes I wore were embarrassing. It really was. They just never understood. And for me, I say they didn't raise me right. Well, I did all the right things, you might say. My room was always neat. You know, I didn't complain about my clothes. I kept my hair cut short. You know, tried to follow their rules to the best of my ability. And yet, I still got in trouble. In fact, it really got to the point where it was best not to even ask for permission to do something, because I knew I'd be told no. Always. And I'd watch and see my brother getting away with things, and I'll give you an example. He was leaving the house, and they asked where he was going, and he says, "I'm going to a basketball game." So they assumed it was over at Francis Scott Key, our high school, and that's only 5 miles away. Well, the next day they found out that he was in an accident down in Westminster. Nothing big, no big deal. You know, they said, "I thought you were going to a basketball game." And he says, "I did." Just wasn't the school they were thinking, and he wasn't going to tell them. Because if he had said where he was going, they just said no. I would tell them what I wanted to do to the detail, thinking I won't be like him. I'll be honest, and I'd be told no. Now, I don't know why a parent wouldn't see that themselves. In fact, I don't know why my parents didn't question their parents' way of raising them. For me, that doesn't make any sense. I had problems with depression, but they didn't want to deal with that. My mother flat out said she didn't like dealing with us when we were sick. That just irritated her to no end. And I can imagine it, because I know how I am, not about being sick, but I get my mind set that this is what I want to do and this is the schedule I want to keep. And then something happens that stops me from being able to do things the way I want. And so if I'm sick, well, now I'm in her way. And that's how she looked at it. It's not a very good way to look at it, but it is how she looked at it, and I can somewhat understand. Now, my father, no matter what I did, like I said, wasn't good enough. You have to realize he also, was raised without having a mother after he was 9 years old. And I know his father was a pretty hard person. However, my father did a lot of running around. I noticed that he would travel from his hometown all the way up to Tawnytown to go roller skating. And he wouldn't have a ride. He would just start walking and hitchhike. And he'd get there in no time at all. Somebody would pick him up and take him. And I guess he found a ride home, or he hitchhiked. But I never heard him not getting home in time. I never heard of his father saying he couldn't go. So he was pretty much left loose. And he had a few exciting nights with driving his father's car and things like that he told about. And for some reason, he was very outgoing, yet he didn't instill any of that in me. And I guess that's where I want to go with next, is the fact that I never had a serious conversation with either of my parents about anything. They never taught me about sex. They didn't impart any of their wisdom. They never said, well, I learned this and that, or I had this experience when I was in college. My mother was a home economics teacher and a math teacher. You know, but she never shared any of that information. She never shared, you know, stories of her life. Now, here's again, I haven't talked about my mother. My mother's parents, of course, had businesses and all. I've talked about that. And whenever they needed her, she had to work. So since they had the skating rink and the bowling alley, she was down there working a lot. Well, they also had the movie theater. So, you know, when they needed her, she had to work for no pay at all. They never gave her a cent. And you know, back then, in bowling alleys, you had to set the pins by hand. They didn't have machines to do that kind of stuff. So it wasn't safe, it wasn't fun, and it wasn't safe when you were back in there, because pins would go flying, you know. So, and the bowling balls were heavy and things like that. It was work. And I will say this, though. Once she graduated from college, they bought her a brand new car. Back then, that was a big deal. Nowadays, kids are getting brand new cars at 16. That's ridiculous. So she did get a little bit of compensation. And really, ever since then, she was always financially comfortable. She never had to worry. She knew she had money if she needed it. So she had that advantage. I don't know where I'm supposed to be at in life. I'm 60 years old, which I hesitate to say. I've accomplished so many things, and yet I've got nothing to show for it. And here I sit in the basement again. Out of all 4 relationships I've had with women, I end up in the basement sooner or later. I don't know whether that's some kind of a sign or not. Maybe I need to take and change some of my own methods. Who knows? Well, it was fun talking, and I guess I'll get back to talking about my, you know, my autobiography, which means I'll be on my college days next. A lot of fun there. Not really, but we'll discuss that. Thanks for listening. Grow up a little.